Hi everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about the 10 biggest books I've read and my experience reading these books. I'll additionally add in the context of being a slow reader. I had so many thoughts about being a slow reader that I made a separate video about the topic, which will be linked in the description below if you're interested. But whether you're a fast reader or slow reader, I hope you get something out of the video because some of the books I'm going to talk about are quite popular. And even if you're a fast reader, it's a time commitment to read a large book. That's time you could be reading several shorter books. So I'm going to be talking about the patience and the payoff as I experienced it. And I have a few notes to mention before I begin. Of course, everything will be timestamped below. When I talk about these books, I will provide the page count, the word count, and the audiobook length. But keep in mind that editions vary in terms of page count. I'm going by the edition I had available, which I will show on the screen. And when it comes to word count, I got these numbers online and I don't know how reliable they are. They might be approximate guesses and not exact. And I did try to rank these books from shortest to longest, but a couple of them could be flipped depending on the page count versus word count and vice versa. Additionally, I'm going to be concise in my thoughts here, but if you want more in-depth reviews of these books, I will provide links to any relevant videos or discussions in the description below. I didn't track how much time it took me to read each book, but I can say on average, it takes me about a month to read a large book. And I want to also say that I don't think a book is good just because it's long. Yes, if there are more pages, maybe there's more potential for further development of storyline, of character work or setting or theme, but I don't pick up a book just because it's long. I pick up a book because it has key themes or elements that appeal to me as a reader. Same goes for a series, whether it's a long series or short series. And not all my opinions on this list are positive, so keep that in mind as we get into the list. The first book I have to talk about is The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois by Jeffers. This book is 816 pages, the word count 269,327, and the audiobook length 29 hours and 49 minutes. This is a contemporary fiction / historical fiction novel. We are following a young Black woman, Ailey Garfield. We follow her journey from childhood to adulthood and learn her identity construction as it's informed by her family members and her community around her in Georgia. Additionally, we have another timeline in the story that follows Ailey's distant relatives in the slave trade in Georgia. Because of that dual timeline exploration, the book reminds me in part of Kindred by Octavia Butler. Now in Kindred, which is a science fiction book, we are following a woman named Dana, a Black woman who is mysteriously thrown into the past, to the antebellum South during the time of slavery, where she's interacting with her relatives, her distant relatives, but she's treated as a slave. And we're seeing how racism and slavery from the past cast a shadow in the present timeline in insidious ways, despite how much we think we've progressed in the present. Although, of course, in Love Songs, it's not sci-fi. We're not having Ailey thrown into the past, but we are exploring her past, of course, with those interludes. And of course, the characters of Dana and Ailey Garfield are very different from one another. And clearly, Kindred is a much, much shorter book than The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. This edition is 295 pages. But I really feel like these two books could be in conversation with one another because of the dual timeline exploration and how it informs identity, especially of a Black woman. Additionally, I'll add that Love Songs explores generational trauma and family dynamics in a compelling way. And this is a book that I listen to on audiobook almost exclusively. This is the only book on this list I can say I did that with. I did check out the hardcover edition from the library, but I mostly listened to the audiobook and I found I could not stop listening because I found the story so compelling. When it comes to other types of books, I sometimes have a hard time keeping things straight when I'm just listening to a book. But this book was easy to follow along on audio. I highly recommend it in that format. So I think if you're interested in a book that is in some ways thematically similar to Octavia Butler's Kindred, another book I love, then maybe check out Love Songs if you feel called to it. I certainly recommend it. Although it's different than what I normally read, I was very rewarded by the whole experience, especially with the audiobook. The Dark Tower by Stephen King makes the list. This is the finale in the Dark Tower series. This book is 864 pages, the word count 276,645, and the audiobook length 28 hours and 50 minutes. In short, this series follows Roland the Gunslinger, who is making a journey to the Dark Tower. He makes some companions along the way who become his found family, which is also called his quartet in this world, in this series. And this is a series in which you have to be okay with weirdness. It is genre-defying, there are worlds melding together, it becomes more and more meta as you go on in the series. And I found that this finale had some deeply emotional moments. I was invested in the characters in the series, and there were some powerful character moments in this last installment. However, there were some moments that felt anticlimactic and that lacked payoff for me personally. I still feel like this was a net positive for me. I immersion read this with the audiobook and the physical format, the hardcover edition from the library, and I found the whole journey very immersive. Now, the ending of this book is polarizing. Some people love it, some people don't love it, and I'm somewhere in between. I feel like the end fits the book, it fits the series. However, I wasn't blown away by it. I expected Stephen King to take a bigger risk with that ending because he took so many risks along the way in this series. But that said, I mean, it works. Maybe I would have been more blown away if I had read this earlier in my reading journey, maybe if I read this when it was published. I'm still overall positive about the series, and I found it was compelling. It didn't feel slow to me. It didn't feel like I needed to work hard to get into the story by any means. So I think especially with the immersive experience with the audiobook and the physical format, it was a compelling, easy, immersive read for me, and one with good emotional payoff. Next on the list is Peril's Gate by Jenny Wirtz. This is book 6 in the Wars of Light and Shadow series, an epic fantasy series that is 11 books in length. This book is 692 pages, but if you include the glossary at the end, it's 721 pages. The word count is approximately 300,000. There is no audiobook for this book. At the time of filming this, there is now an audiobook for book 1 in the series, and there are audiobooks for the last 2 books, I believe, but there are no audiobooks for any of the books in between. And I've only read books 1 through 7 so far. I understand that later books in the series get longer, but I'm going with the idea that this is the longest I've read. Now, in the hardcover editions, the second book, Ships of Merrier, is combining that book, book 2, with book 3, War Host of Vastmark. So that book is technically bigger, but I'm going with the idea that those are 2 separate books. That's how I read them. So I will say that Peril's Gate is the biggest book I've read in Wars of Light and Shadow so far. And this is a series that follows 2 half-brothers, one with the gift of shadow, one with the gift of light. And there is this curse, this mist wraith that has pervaded the land. It has driven away creatures such as sun children, centaurs, and unicorns. And the magic of this world is metaphysical with frequency and vibration, if you think of those 2 things as combined. So frequency as vibration, as sound, and also as color and light. All these things are combined, and it connects into the earth and the environment and the elements and the emotions of the characters. All these things are interconnected in the world, and I think that's very clever personally. Now, the writing style is ambitious in trying to recreate that ethereal atmosphere and that interconnectedness of all of these magical elements. And for that reason, the writing style is highly descriptive with a great amount of attention to detail, with great thought and intention put into every single sentence. And because of that, these books are not fast reads. They take time. They are not easy to read in some ways because of the style. They're not hard to follow in terms of the storylines and the characters and what's happening in the plot, but they do take time because of that highly descriptive style. And so I read this on my Kindle because I found it helped me to just focus on what was on the page and not be distracted by how much more of the book I had to read, because it did take a long time to read this. And I unfortunately will say this is my least favorite Wars of Light and Shadow book so far. The first half I did enjoy, and there was a moment that deeply moved me, but the second half had a whole section that I did not enjoy reading. It served a purpose in the overarching story, and I'm sure it'll play a role in later books, but I didn't enjoy reading that part, and unfortunately it did make me feel less excited about picking up the next book. But that said, I did pick up the next book and I enjoyed it quite a bit. So I'm still overall positive about the Wars of Light and Shadow, but I will say that this is probably my least favorite book so far. Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb makes the list. This book is 896 pages, the word count 307,400, and the audiobook length 35 hours and 20 minutes. Ship of Magic is book 1 in the Life Ship Traders trilogy, following the Farseer trilogy in the greater realm of the Elderlings. I have chosen not to listen to the audiobooks for this series so far. I heard negative reviews for the Farseer trilogy narration and negative reviews for the narration of Live Ship Traders, and I have felt rewarded reading these books visually, which I'll talk about here in a minute. This is nautical fantasy. When I picked up this book, all I really knew is that it had sentient ships, it's multi-POV in third person, and that there was a despicable character named Kyle. I don't think you really need to know much more going into this, but as for the reading experience, I found it so immersive. I feel like Robin Hobb has a gift for character development and for dialogue. I found that the story just unfolded so beautifully and seamlessly. There was a great flow to the writing, and I feel as though Robin Hobb is gifted at creating a visual picture in such a seamless, easy, organic way. So I could always visualize what she's describing, and she shows you the world through character perspectives, but not only does she show it to you, present it to you through the character's perspective, she gets you to feel the world through their perspective. I feel like there's a subtle shift in tone from each character perspective she's writing from. And I also found that each character has a deep internal conflict. It was never a matter of changing perspectives and feeling disappointed that I was moving to a different perspective. I felt invested in every character in this book, with one exception, and that has to do with the perspective of sea serpents. Those sections are very short. There are very few sections like that, but I did not enjoy those particular sections. Otherwise, I loved this book. This was an overall positive experience for me, and I found that it probably took me a little less time than it would normally take me to read a book this size, because I just couldn't put it down. I found it so easy to get wrapped up in the story. I found myself wanting to get back into the world as soon as possible. I know Robin Hobb is often referred to as a slow burn writer, but because I found this book so emotionally gripping and so visually immersive, I found that this book was so easy to keep reading and to get swept up in, so it never felt slow for me personally. Lonesome Dove makes the list. This book is 864 pages, the word count 365,712, and the audiobook length 36 hours and 41 minutes. This is an epic adventure Western story following a group of men and a woman who make a journey from southern Texas to Montana, herding an enormous amount of cattle. The landscape settings are sweeping, the characters are believably flawed, and the action scenes are heart-pounding. I will say that the beginning of the story takes its time. It takes its time establishing the characters, the setting, especially the historical cultural backdrop of the story. But then once the story moves, it really carries you along with it. Thematically, I would say the story explores friendship, loneliness. It's in part coming of age, but it also explores older age, learning to let go in older age. There are also different perspectives on masculinity, and it also explores trauma. Now, there are violent scenes incorporating racism and SA. I immersion read this with the audiobook and the physical format, the hardcover edition from the library, but a word of warning about that audiobook. The narrator breathes heavily into the microphone for the first few chapters. I don't know if editing suddenly kicked in or if he became aware of this, but it goes away, and I found his performance phenomenal. This is one of the most memorable reading experiences for me. High payoff for me personally. I didn't find it was effort to read this book. I found it carried me along very smoothly. I was a little bit conflicted about the last couple of pages, but it was still just a worthwhile, memorable read overall. Toll the Hounds by Steven Erikson makes the list. This is book 8 in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, an epic fantasy series of 10 very big books, and according to word count, Toll the Hounds is the biggest. This book is 829 pages, the word count 389,000, and the audiobook length 44 hours and 1 minute. I immersion read this book with the physical format and the audiobook, and I found that helpful for me because it required a great amount of attention to detail, great amount of focus, especially for the complexity of this book. Now, all Malazan books are complex because they incorporate multiple storylines and themes. I found this book the most complex in terms of what it's trying to explore. This book explores themes such as grief and death and coming to a crossroads in life at the end of life. It additionally explores themes such as redemption versus absolution, whether you could be absolved of all your wrongdoing in a single moment, or whether you have to go on a path of redemption to pay off that karmic debt. I'll also add that Steven Erikson's prose is rich. There is a great amount of subtext. It's quite emotional at times. There is a lot of depth to the writing. There is poetry in the epigraphs, and there are even poetic epigraphs that open up sections of the book. So this is a book worthy of deep exploration and reflection. I will say, however, this is one of my least favorite Malazan books. I found myself feeling outside of the experience because this is a book where I felt like it was so personal. It felt like the way it was exploring its themes was personal in a masculine tone. And because of that, I felt like it was speaking to a very specific kind of reader. I'm not saying all female readers will feel the same way I did, but in my personal experience, I just felt like it was speaking more to a male perspective in a personal way. I appreciated what it was going for, but I just felt slightly outside of it. That said, I mean, I have enjoyed exploring this. I did go back and reread certain passages, so it was worthwhile. And I did go right into book 9 in the series, if that tells you anything. So yeah, this is one of my least favorite books in the series. It certainly took a long time, as all the Malazan books take a long time for me to read, but it was still worth it, even though, like I said, I felt emotionally distanced. A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin, which is book 3, and A Song of Ice and Fire makes my list. This book is 924 pages, or 973 pages if you add the appendix. The word count, 424,000. The audiobook length, 47 hours and 34 minutes. Like what I said about Realm of the Elderlings, this is a series that I've enjoyed reading with my eyes only. I've read the 5 books published twice, and I've enjoyed this experience because I adore the characters, I love the settings, I even enjoy the politics in this world, and political fantasy is something that's a little hit or miss for me, but I find that Martin is gifted at matching internal conflict with the characters with external conflict of what's happening in the world. So I have found myself deeply invested in the journey, and I love the dragons in this world as well. So this is a series that I feel does a brilliant job with setting things up from book 1, especially in this book. There are several climactic moments in this book, in Storm of Swords, that are set up brilliantly from book 1. And I think for that reason, many people consider A Storm of Swords their favorite. I also love the character arcs in this story. In fact, I did a whole video dedicated to Jaime Lannister. And I would say that this book was 100% worth every single page. It was thrilling from beginning to end. I love this book. High payoff. It did take me probably a month to read both times I read it, but 100% worth it. Next on the list is Shogun by James Clavell, which is a massive book. This book is 1,300 pages, the word count 421,270, and the audiobook length 53 hours and 34 minutes. This is a historical fiction novel following John Blackthorne, an English pilot who ends up with his ship on the shore of Japan in the 17th century, facing a culture that is radically different from their own. Different notions of sex and death, what it means to be shogun, what it means to be a samurai. And the story is highly political with a great focus on scheming. It's told in omniscient narration, so we are head hopping quite a bit, guessing at character motivations, and it is dialogue heavy, I would say. I enjoyed this book. I took 3 months reading this, I believe. I think it was 3 months. I read this as part of a read along with friends, had wonderful discussions along the way, and I highly recommend that approach if you're a slow reader and big books intimidate you. I think that structured read-along approach was wonderful for this. I also immersion read this with the audiobook, but I will say that as much as I appreciated this book and as much as I got out of the book learning about the culture of Japan at that time, I also found this book lacked for me in atmosphere and visual immersion. I found I got those things from the show adaptation, however. So I found that the show adaptation complemented my experience of reading this book. And I found I enjoyed the show more because I've read the book. So they complemented each other, in my opinion. And I think this is a worthwhile read. However, even though it was lacking for me in places, I found that I became invested in the characters And the ending of this book, the end of this book is one of the best endings I've ever read. So I think the payoff was there for me, even though there were certain elements I was wanting more from in my reading experience. I read It by Stephen King. This book is 1,153 pages, the word count 444,671, the audiobook length 44 hours and 55 minutes. This horror standalone is about the nature of cyclical horror and trauma that follows a group of kids in their childhood years in Derry, Maine, and then following them into adulthood in the 1980s. So there is a dual timeline that's explored in this book. That's what takes up a lot of pages, as you're going back and forth between the years of these kids experiencing this horror in the town of Derry, Maine in the 1950s, and then following them again, bringing them back together in a later timeline in the 1980s. Additionally, we get a historical perspective on the town of Derry, Maine, and how this cyclical horror is broader in scope than just the characters that we're following. So King spends several pages fleshing that out, fleshing out the history, and also bringing detail to the small town there. And so many of King's strengths come through in the pages of It. His strength for writing child perspectives and adult perspectives, his gift for writing characters in different eras or different decades. I find he has a gift for doing that. He also has this gift for bringing a small town to life, and he also has a gift for combining supernatural horror elements, in this case Pennywise, the clown Pennywise, with realism, with realistic horror. And the horrors in this book include racism, misogyny, homophobia, bullying, and additionally, I'll say that the kid group come together because they are all struggling in their home lives. They're struggling either with domestic abuse, with neglect, with Munchausen syndrome, or with other kinds of conflicts. And you see in this book how those conflicts in childhood carry forward into adult years. So I thought it was brilliant the way King did that, and the way that he explored friendship, the friendship dynamics between these characters. So as much as I appreciate what King was doing in this book, I have to admit that I did not care for a certain scene towards the end of it. And I knew going into this book that there was a scene. I didn't know what the scene would be. And when I got to it, I wasn't a fan. And I also wasn't super crazy about the end of the book. So while I greatly appreciated everything that was building in the first 3 quarters of the book, I felt so mixed about that last quarter that I haven't picked up another Stephen King book since then. It is a long book, and to have that much disappointment at the end was really sad, as a slow reader especially. Rhythm of War is book 4 in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, an epic fantasy series. There are 5 books published, and I've only read books 1 through 4. This book is 1,230 pages, but if you exclude the appendix, which is called the Ars Arcanum in this series, it is 1,219 pages. The word count, 455,891, and the audiobook length, 57 hours and 26 minutes. I read this book at the time it was published, and I immersion read it with the audiobook. That same year, I had read the first 3 books visually only with ebooks, and I found that my experience of Stormlight started to decline with this book. One of the reasons it declined is because of Sanderson's adherence to the same structure for every Stormlight book. In this world, in this series, we get prologues that explore a different angle of a certain event, which I found interesting. There are also interludes to give you different perspectives of the world of Roshar. I haven't quite found payoff in those perspectives yet. And then the other thing is that there are flashback sequences dedicated to different characters in each book. And unfortunately, the character that we flashed back to in this book, in Rhythm of War, I did not find compelling. The other thing I'll say is that Sanderson loves to go into detail explaining how the magic works, and he picks strange moments in which to do this. I did not care for that. And I also found that the mental health explorations were not on a level I would prefer. That said, I'm just one reader, and I know this series, it resonates deeply with many readers. And if that's the case, then what I feel doesn't matter. It matters for those who are fans of the series. I think that unfortunately, I have found that this is just not the series for me after all. And after finishing this book, I decided to take a Sanderson diet. I didn't want to get burned out because I did enjoy my experience that far. But sadly, I have not found myself interested in picking up another Sanderson book since. And maybe with all the negative reviews I saw in this corner of BookTube about Wind and Truth, that might have not helped. It sounded like the issues I had in Rhythm of War carried over into Wind and Truth, from what I understand. So I'll never say never, but I, at this point, don't feel motivated to pick up another Sanderson book. And I would say if this calls to you, if you're interested in Sanderson, I would not be intimidated by the page length, though the books are quite long. This is the longest book on the list. They read fairly easily because Sanderson's prose is not dense. It is fairly accessible. I think it's intended to be accessible. So I would not let that deter you if you're a slow reader. Sadly for me, this just didn't have the payoff I was hoping for. That is it. Those are the 10 biggest books I've read and my experiences reading them, largely influenced by the fact I'm a slow reader. I did notice that the ones I felt more negative about did diminish my interest in picking up another book by that author anytime soon, but there were some favorites on this list as well, and I don't regret reading any of the books I mentioned. I feel like each one had a place on my reading journey. I would love to hear from you now, though. What are your thoughts on big books? Have you read any of the books I mentioned? Are you planning to read any of these books? I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.